Hello, welcome to UPLINK. Welcome to Gold Rush with Dan Kitchen. I see we have Mixer in. How are you? Thank you for joining me, and welcome to the first Long Island Retro Gaming Expo virtual event using UPLINK. I'm here to talk about my Atari 2600 game Gold Rush, which is going to be released sometime later this year. And I've got a little presentation about how I came about finding it and a little back history about myself and about the game itself. So what I'll do is I'll discuss briefly for a bit now exactly how the game came about. In 1982, I had joined Activision as a designer of Atari 2600 games. And my first game I created was Crackpots. And after Crackpots, I had moved on to looking at creating a game about railroads. So why don't we pick that up, and I'll put a little presentation up on the screen so you can see that, and we'll talk about that from there. Let's see. Give me 1 second. I will share my screen. Okay, this is the 37-year journey of Keystone Capers 2. I'm going to start a little bit by talking about some of my history in the game business. I first started on the Apple II computer. That was released by Apple in the mid-70s when Steve Jobs and Wozniak were there to create this computer system in actually Steve Jobs' garage. From there, I actually created in 1981 my first two games, which were Crime Stopper and Crystal Caverns. These were basically text adventures. I'd also done work on some games that others may have heard of: Little Computer People, Gary Kitchen's Game Maker, Greeting Card Maker, and the Designer's Pencil. Crystal Caverns was a full paragraph recognition text adventure, not unlike Zork, not unlike the original Colossal Cave that you could see on the mainframes of the day. Crime Stopper as well was a full sentence recognition text adventure. Excuse me. And both of these games did very well in the Apple arena. I then moved on to the Atari VCS, which we're here to talk about. And while at Activision in 1982 to 1986, I actually created a number of games, Crackpots being my first, Kung Fu Master. I did Ghostbusters. I had worked on Commando, Double Dragon, Ikari Warriors, River Raid 2. And then for Atari, after my stint at Activision, I created the 2600 version of Crossbow and worked on a game called My Golf. Crackpots was my first game, released in 1983, subsequent before the video game crash. And this game you may be familiar with. It includes Potsy at the top of the screen there, dropping flower pots and on an approaching army of bugs that are trying to infiltrate his building. I had also written Kung Fu Master, which some of you may have seen, which is a game based on the arcade classic. And then I moved on to Ghostbusters, which was originally designed by David Crane for the Commodore 64. I had put together the 2600 version. And then again, I mentioned Crossbow is the version from the Atari arcade, or actually the arcade created by Exidy, which was one of their light gun games, which they had in the arcades. I had then moved on to the Commodore 64 and created some games you may be familiar with. Once again, Crossbow, Game Maker, Flight of the Intruder was a flight game I had worked on, the Rocky Horror Show, of course, no necessary prelude to that. It's the infamous movie. And then Destroyer Escort for Microprose. During one of my During my time with the Commodore 64, I had a great fun creating for that system. And eventually that moved us on to the Nintendo Entertainment System. For the NES, I helped work on a number of titles that may be familiar to all of you. The Simpsons titles, Bart versus the World, Bart versus the Space Mutants, Bart versus Radioactive Man. I did a number of licensed titles, Swamp Thing I worked on, a little Fisher-Price product, Killer Tomatoes, and then Ghostbusters 2 for the release of the sequel movie. Also had a chance to do a lot of work on the NES, which was a great, the Super NES, which was a great system, and ended up working on Vidiots, Ren and Stimpy, Turn and Burn No Fly Zone, Home Improvement, Family Dog, which was a Steven Spielberg show back in the 80s, and Casper, and then The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle. Interestingly, I worked on the Sega CD, which was a short-lived platform, but probably one of my most infamous games is the game I worked on that was never released. I was fortunate enough to help design and manage and produce with Penn & Teller Smoke and Mirrors. That has since become a bit of an underground game. When it was completed, it wasn't released due to the company subsequently filing bankruptcy. But the game that I had worked on that title, which I'm most proud of, strangely enough, is Desert Bus. And I'm sure Desert Bus is infamous for its very boring gameplay, which was specifically designed at the request of Penn Jillette. And that game now helps raise money for children's cancer once a year for a Desert Bus for Hope marathon. And so that's probably one of my most proud accomplishments, is that a product I worked on that was intended to be the most boring game has actually done the most good for people. So let's get back to the 2600. In 1983, my brother Gary created Keystone Capers for the Atari 2600. Great game. I'm sure some of you have played it. It sold very well at Activision. And about the time I had finished Crackpots, Keystone Capers was already out. And I was playing around with some ideas for a new game. This is probably 1983, June. And I was always a big fan of trains. So I've always had a love for railroads. And I thought, let me create a new Atari game based on railroads. And after thinking about that, I thought what would look best would be perhaps a side view. And a lot of the original trains from the early days were placed in the desert. They actually became transcontinental railroads to bring people to the west, to the east, vice versa. So I thought, okay, let me start with a blank screen, which is what we always did at Activision. And let me originally set up the sky from the ground. And this is literally how I created what became of Keystone Capers 2, which is ultimately what's become of Gold Rush, which is the new game I'm now finishing. And in the process of doing this, I said, let's lay the Activision sunset in there. Every game, if you recall, had the Activision sunsetter, or many of them did. That was first originated by Dave Crane and Steve Cartwright, I believe, in Barnstorming. And it later became part of our logo, as you can see at the bottom of the screen. And so after that, I said, let me put in some mountains. Nice desert look, some mountains back there. And then I thought, let's create the box cars. And using the Atari's Playfield background mode, I was able to create some box cars and eventually give them some wheels and put them on a railroad bed of ties. The Atari, I believe most people know, was designed by the Atari company to replicate arcade games in the home environment. And they really weren't expecting a lot to be done with this other than simple arcade games. So the original game that came with the Atari 2600 was Combat. And Combat was a game with just 2 tanks and 2 bullets and a little background area that you could move around in. So the design of the Atari 2600 chipset was really to display simply 2 objects, 2 bullets, another object they called a ball that was used in things like table tennis or Pong, and these little bits of graphics you could call playfield that were pretty big, clunky chunks of things. And through actually a lot of the techniques David Crane created and invented, we were able to manipulate the machine to give the appearance that it's using more than 2 objects per scan line. And in most cases, the most you can do is 6 objects per scan line. I was fortunate enough to trick the machine here and create 8 objects for the 8 wheels on the train. And so after I had this, I said, let's put in a little background. I ended up picking some cacti, since you're in the desert, and ended up setting them up so they could parallax scroll as you move. And then I said to Gary, I said, look, here's the screen I have. I need a character. Well, Keystone Capers had done really well at retail, very popular game. And so Gary said, why don't you just pick Keystone Kelly, put him on the train, and let's have it be another Keystone Kelly adventure. And I started to think about a backstory. Well, that's kind of cool. Keystone Kelly kind of left the department store at Southwick's and has moved west and is now taking on a job, as a cop on a desert train, making sure that everyone on the train is kind of staying within the boundaries of the railroad's rules. So with that said, I had this game working and this game designed. And you can see here, this is the original prototype from 1983 of Keystone Capers. The added music is not indicative of the Atari, but the screen is, and you'll see that I had him jumping back and forth, had him moving around. And then as I started to design this, I said, well, I put some ladders on the cars. So let me put down the fact that he can climb down certain ladders. That way you can have objects coming by really fast that he's got to kind of either duck under or get down off the top of the car to let them go by. And then I said, all right, let me add a caboose. It's a train. So let me put a little caboose car, and you can start from the back of the train, and then you can run and jump, and you can start going forward while your goal is, as it worked out, to let's get to the front of the train. So Keystone Kelly here is running car to car, and I imagined I'd see all sorts of desert objects flying by and vultures and various things like that. And eventually he would get to the coal car, of which you see here, and then eventually onto the actual engine. So I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. So I've got this train built, and I've got this character moving, and now I can put wheels on that, and I can get objects coming into the game, and let's start to make this a real product. Well, then we hit 1983 sometime around September, and the infamous 1983 great video game crash occurs. And what actually transpired was that companies started creating video games for the Atari that were low quality. So originally Atari creates the 2600. They have a set of designers. They make all these games. Atari does not believe in giving the designers credits. And there's 4 guys who work in Atari: Larry Kaplan, Al Miller, Bob Whitehead, and David Crane. Say, we did a lot of cool games on the Atari. We'd like to be recognized for our work. And Atari said, no, it's not our policy. So those guys left about 1978, 79, and formed Activision. And for the longest time, for gamers, you could either buy an Atari cartridge or an Activision cartridge. Well, about 1983, January-ish, my brother Gary and I started noticing other games would come onto the market that were created by other companies that didn't really take pride in the type of products they were doing. It seemed that they just wanted to create games to make money. And the first of these we saw was Games by Apollo's Skeet Shoot game. And if you've ever seen Games by Apollo's Skeet Shoot game, it's definitely not the most high quality Atari game. Well, then a bunch of other companies started coming to the scenes, and all of a sudden retailers are putting these games up for $39 next to E.T. or next to Keystone Capers or next to Crackpots, and they're just not selling. And then all these products start coming out, and the store shelves get flooded with games, but they're bad games. So inevitably, so many games came out that the retailers couldn't sell all the games they had, and the entire video game industry came down to a crash. And you were having bins in toy stores, bins in Toys R Us, KB Toy and Hobby World, bins right by the entrance with hundreds of Atari games. And so a consumer then who purchased the games was not necessarily the player. The player was typically a boy, girl, about 10 years old. So they didn't walk into the store and whip out their American Express card and buy the game. Their parents did. So their parents would walk in and say, there's this game up there by a company called Activision for $40, or there's a bin over there that has these games that are $7 for the same price. They would inevitably go and buy these lousy games. And so Activision and Atari couldn't compete. And eventually the retailers got tired of selling this stuff that didn't move, and they were very negative on video games. And companies like Atari got rid of games so fast to clear up their inventory and take tax deductions that they literally took ETs, of which they made more than the number of systems were out there, and they buried them in the New Mexico desert. So that was the crash of 1983. So what I did during that time is I took my cartridge of Keystone Cannonball, which I just showed you. I burned the ROM, put it into a cartridge, brought it home sometime in 1983, and lost it. Basically, like the last scene you see here of Indiana Jones, I put it in with other valuables, forgot all about it, mentioned it throughout the years. As I recall, I would visit and sometimes speak at the Classic Gaming Convention, which was run by John Hardy, Joe Santilli, and Sean of the guys who owned the National Video Game Museum in Texas. And they would run this show, and I would often go there and speak or go there as an attendee and have these discussions and say, guys, I had this Activision game that was never released that no one really ever saw. And it was Keystone Capers 2. And it was this game with Keystone Kelly on a train. And, I would tell this to them every year. And about the 19th or 20th year of going to these things, they basically looked at me and said, we think you're full of crap. This game doesn't exist. We've been hearing about this. Kind of either put up or shut up. So we're going to move to the summer of 2018. Just a couple of years ago, I decided I'm going to clean out some of my offsite storage facilities, and let's go in and start looking around for what I have. I'm there with my wife, and we're cleaning things out, and I said to her, there's this game I once had. It's in a red label, and it's an original Keystone Capers 2 game. It's the only one of its kind. It's probably worth a lot of money. And she started pulling out things like floppy disks and pulling out things like Commodore games and saying, is this it? Is this it? No. Well, then she reached into an obscure box in the back corner and pulled out a little cartridge. It said Keystone Cannonball, copyright 1983 Activision Inc. And I said, oh my God, that's the game. What I did at the moment it happened, so I walked out of the storage, I picked up my iPhone and I called John Hardy, the director of the National Video Game Museum, to simply tell him that after 20 years of seeing him and talking about this game, that I wasn't full of crap. And as fate as would have it, he was in Long Island visiting with his mother at the time. And the next day he came over to my place in New Jersey, and we plugged it in, and the cartridge came up, and he was overjoyed to see that there was actually a Keystone Cannonball game. Inevitably, or eventually, I ended up donating it to the National Video Game Museum instead of selling it, so that they could have it as part of their their presentation on Activision and some of the games that I had created. What you now see is the game Gold Rush that I am now finishing. So what I did was I took the game and rewrote it from scratch. You can see the similarities. You've got a guy on the train. He's now hopping over things. I now have enemies. I now have a variety of enemies in the game. Those are tarantulas. The mountains, as you can see in the background, are no longer static. They're now scrolling. With the cacti, I added dirt that scrolls. I added multiple train cars. As you saw in the initial scene with the caboose, you now climb down into cars. There was my original idea of, hey, something comes across the car, let's climb down the ladder and let it go by. I put in some little twisters. We have some desert birds. Now I've got some cars with boxes and pipes. And as you can see, it's no longer Keystone Kelly. When I originally found the cartridge from Activision, it is an Activision-owned property. I don't have the rights to Keystone Kelly. There you can see him going down into one of the coach cars and picking up a gold bar. I didn't have the rights to Keystone Kelly. I didn't have the rights to Keystone Capers. So I literally wrote the game from scratch again and started with Keystone Kelly's cousin. This is Casey O'Kelly. Casey's from the old country, moved back here and decided to go west instead of east. Didn't follow his cousin to New York, but went to the west, California, and is a conductor on a railroad. And as you can see, similar to Keystone Capers, you've got a guy running. If you hit an enemy, you lose time. I have different coal cars, and now I have a much nicer engine coming up, which you'll see right here. The engine's finally finished. So the goal of the game is to grab all these gold bars, drop them off in this gold car, and then run forward and jump into the engine and slow the train down. Once you slow the train down, all the points, all the time that's left gets converted to points. So again, as you see here with the two games, the game on the left is the original Keystone Cannonball written in 1983. And strangely enough, what happened is 3 months before that cartridge was found, my brother Gary had called me and said, hey, I found this tool online in a browser that lets you write Atari 2600 code. And I thought it was the coolest thing, and I started playing around with it. He started playing around with it. And I said, oh my God, I can actually write 6502 assembly language on the left part of the screen. And on the right part of the screen, it shows me what I'm running. So I said to my wife, I said, you know something? I'm going to recreate this game I lost in 1983. And I started rewriting the Keystone Capers 2 game on this tool using the browser emulator. And about 3 months into it is when summer happened in 1983, when I ended up finding the original cartridge. And what you see here is really the two games side by side. And I was amazed at how well I had recreated the scene from 1983. And in fact, I was amazed at how I had made it look so much better in many ways. And I kind of attribute that to the fact that I had 7 or 8 more Atari 2600 games under my belt by the time I reached 2018 versus in 1983 when I only had 1 game that I had completed. And so I thought it was very interesting to sit and do the comparison. And as you see, the game is not going to be released under Activision again, of course, because I don't work with Activision, nor am I affiliated with them. And the game will now be under a company called Tiki Vision, which I've created as an homage to Activision and to all things tiki, which I love, the South Seas and the whole tiki scene. And so there you have the past and the present right next to each other. And the game will be coming out as Dan Kitchen's Gold Rush. You may go to my site at dankitchengames.com and subscribe to my blog, and you will get updates on the game. The game will be released, and you will have the opportunity to also earn a collectible patch. That was a great thing that Activision did in the 1980s. People loved our clubs and our patches. And if you don't recall, or you're not familiar with that, in 1983, 84, you'd buy an Atari Activision game, you go home and play it, and there was a certain score plateau you had to reach to be able to win or earn a patch. And so you would take a photograph with the Insta camera of the day or 35 millimeter camera, take a picture of the screen on the TV set showing your score, mailing it to Activision, and then Jan Marcella, who ran our customer service or consumer relations department, would send back a letter, which some of you may have seen online that is out there, and a patch. And these were patches that were beautifully created. They were woven patches that you would put onto your jackets or whatnot. And so the Activision patches of the 1980s have become quite collectible, and I'm going to continue the tradition of having all of the games that I create now having patches. And if you reach a certain plateau in Gold Rush, you'll be part of the Golden Spike Club. I'm also releasing a series of collectible trading cards with the game. And I started this because I started going to conventions the last few years. And at the conventions, I wanted to give out something about the game and something that was collectible. So I inevitably started creating these cards with characters from the game and screenshots from the game. And I released one at a number of trade shows, Portland Retro Gaming Expo, and other shows around the country. So what I'm going to do is expand these to include the almost 40 characters. You can see some of them there. That's Keystone O'Kelly. We have the Crawling Tarantula. We have a Bunny Magic Hat and a Snake Basket. I think you, on the video, had seen the Snake Basket and Crawling Tarantula. And so I'm going to be releasing these cards, which you can buy as a set when you get the game. I also have, if you look at my site, when creating the game, I thought, Activision had a newsletter, and we would send this out occasionally to consumers, and people would like seeing news about Activision. And I thought, let me come up with a cool way to do the same thing, but to give the players pre-release notes on the game, give them some sort of hints on how the game will be played. And so indicative with the Old West is the Old Western newspaper. And so I created the Gold Rush Gazette. And this is based in the fictitious town of Gold Rush Gulch, where Casey O'Kelly is working as the conductor. And in each of these newspapers, which you can get online by signing up to my blog and going back to past blogs, you can download a version of the 4 newspapers. And in there are interesting stories that I've created about Gold Rush, about the railroad. And ultimately, each one is about the different kind of cars you will find in the game. And each character, some of the characters are mentioned in there, and ways that you may be able to avoid them while playing the game. There will be other Gold Rush Gulch newspapers coming out. So again, I encourage you to go to dankitchengames.com, and you can subscribe with the yellow button. And the blog will be sent to you, and you will be able to see future editions of the Gold Rush Gazette. So I want to thank you for watching that. And I'm going to head back over here, and thought it would be interesting now to show some of the work that is currently being done on the version of the game going forward. So what I decided to do was I was going to share with you my Stella 6.0 emulator, which I can do, and show you some of the work in progress that has started from the conception of the game again back in 2018 to its current build today. Some of these builds don't run, and I don't recall which ones. I'm actually up to my 203rd build of Gold Rush. So when I design a game, you inevitably start by putting little pieces up. You put up the mountains, as I showed in the presentation. You put up the cacti, you put up the train car, and inevitably that happens, but as you write code, you usually break things. And so in the form of breaking things, I end up having to fix them. And so on this list, there may be some ROM images you'll see that that won't necessarily look right. So I thought that would be interesting for everyone to see. Let's see if I can do this. Let's see how I do this over here. Pop that over there, and then I am going to run my latest build. And now what you're all seeing really is behind the scenes. So in the 1980s, you wouldn't be able to see this. This would be in the Activision back lab. And in Activision in California, there was this beautiful building they had, but there was this area that no one could go into. It was for designers only. It had a key lock on the door with a pass card. And we actually had the same thing when we started the Activision Eastern Design Center here in New Jersey. And you couldn't get back there unless you were an Activision designer. And actually, when we would visit the folks at Activision in California, we would go back, we would work with them in the lab, and then we'd inevitably go out to lunch. And we always had to be careful what we talked about at lunch, because you're sitting in Silicon Valley, in Cupertino, in Mountain View, and in Santa Clara, and you're sitting at a Marie Callender's, and you don't know if the guys next to you work for Atari. So you have to be very careful with what you share. So we we always had to be careful. I'm going to now share the screen, and this is my current emulator view. I think you should be seeing that. Hopefully, you will be seeing the screen there. Someone write a note. Let me know that you're actually seeing that over there. And I'll get it running. And you see now we have Casey O'Kelly on top of the train. And it's going through the desert. And I can move him using the joystick or the keyboard in this case. And as I mentioned previously, a lot of these cars you can go into. So here is what is in the caboose car. We've got a little stove for him. And so you will see enemies in here. And we'll climb up here. Now, what you're seeing is a work in progress build. So this is not the full game. So what you'll see is I've been testing certain things. So there are collectibles in the game. You'll be collecting extra lives, which are going to be hats for Keystone, for Casey O'Kelly. And you have balloons throughout the train, which you can collect as other items. You also have gold watches, and then you see the number 50 up there. The number 50 is the amount of time you have for the level. In Keystone Kelly, Keystone Capers, the time always counted down, and if you hit an object, you lost some time, and inevitably you had to catch Harry Hooligan before the time ran out. Well, in Gold Rush, you do lose time in the same way, but you also can collect pocket watches along the way, and pocket watches will gain time for Casey. And while you're playing, you'll have things like these balloons. I've got a balloon down there, so I've got to go down and get it. And you'll learn that you've got to go down kind of at a strategic position to get it. And you can go down and burst it, and now I get 200 points for that balloon. And in this build you're seeing, I'm actually playing with going into the various cars. So, I mean, Every car you have a hatch on, you can go down into. And this is an interesting thing to discuss. My original thought was when you go down into the cars, the entire screen turns into the car that you're in. And I'll show you this by going to one of the early builds here. You'll see gold car. That was my early view at what I'm thinking is going on when you go into one of the cars. And I thought maybe I would take up the entire background and that would be the inside of a car. And as you can see, the perspective is kind of really big, but Casey O'Kelly begins to look really small. And so I thought, that didn't look right. So why don't I actually go and instead of doing that, let me make the sizes of the cars the exact size that they are on the main screen. So on the main screen, you'll see that when you go down into a car, literally, it just turns off the camera everywhere outside of the car, and you are now going to be inside of the car itself. And then when you jump out of the car, you'll see that everything else turns on, and you now see the outside of the car as it was. So let's continue here. And in this build, I'm testing some of the other hatches, make sure they all work. And as you also notice, you'll see that a lot of the hatches, or all the hatches, are color-coded. Well, that's because they're all based upon switches. And you will find throughout the game blue switches, or red switches, or yellow, or purple. And you'll find that as you move each of these switches, you'll be controlling a hatch on a car, but it won't necessarily be the car that you will be seeing on the screen. So the game is not only a race against time, but it's also a puzzle game. So you may have a bit of gold locked in a car below you. You can't get into it. You have to run a few screens to the right. You find the blue switch, you hit the blue switch, you go back, the blue hatch is now open. I go down, I get the gold, I pop up. And the goal of the game, as I mentioned, is to collect gold pieces. They'll be scattered in cars, and in the early levels, you'll have very simply 1 or 2 pieces to acquire. And in later levels, you'll have up to 10 pieces to acquire. Unlike the box cars, these are coach cars. So when you go into it, there's coach seats. Up, and there's an extra life. Let me grab that. And it should turn my life meter up there up to 3, and it does. So now I've got an extra life. So let me pop over, and we have another set of coach cars, and what's down here? Oh, another extra life. And we can go further, and we have a longer coach car, which you can see. And interestingly enough, these cars can be linked together so that, similar to Pitfall, you will have gameplay above the train and below the train, where Dave had gameplay above in the jungle, or below where you had to race through the underground and avoid scorpions. So by linking 3 or 4 of these large cars together, you'll climb down into a set of cars and you'll have a variety of enemies and pickups to deal with in 3 car screens worth of gameplay. Then you have to either be able to get out of that car at the end or run back and be able to get back out onto the top of the train. And as we move on here, you'll see I also have dining cars. These are the red cars. These are kind of cars with a table, and in the various cars on the tables, you'll have various items. And again, you'll have the short ones there. Oh, there's another extra life. Let me get that. And of course, if you bump against the wall, you're just kind of bouncing around there. And then you'll have these longer ones, which may have people sitting in. And of course, as Tiki Vision is an homage or an honor to Activision, and Gold Rush is an honor to Keystone Capers, you may see in the various travels across the desert some of Activision's most favorite celebrities. I think in some of the coach cars, you may find Pitfall Harry. You may find Keystone Kelly. You may find Frostbite Bailey, and some of the other Activision characters you've come to know and love. And so these cars, which don't actually function properly right now, these are some of the magic cars. And in the magic cars, you had noticed, I think, in my presentation, a bunny with a hat. In the early 1900s, late 1800s, a lot of famous magicians traveled from city to city. You had Houdini, you had Blackstone, you had various magicians, and they would all travel with boxcars full of their act. So the way to get from, Chicago to St. Louis was going to be, done in a train. And they would take a train and put all their stuff in train boxcars. And so these boxcars here are magic boxcars. And these are actually going to be secret cars, which I can't divulge what they are at the moment. You have another car there that's and then you have some of these cars where, you have things that are connected that you have to kind of scale. And I have a balloon I've got to get, which I've got to kind of do and not hit that cow skull, which I did there. I've got some more of these secret cars, which you're seeing. And there's the gold car. As you see, it's got barred windows. That's where you actually end up delivering all the gold pieces you've collected. So that little hatch there will only open once you've collected every gold bar that is missing on that train. And then you will run over and inevitably run to the locomotive, which in this current build isn't working. So that's why I snapped all the way back to the beginning. I think we have some Q&A coming in from people. I think we have some chats or some questions. Let me go on to that if I can. Ron asks, how much time does it take to write the code for one item in the game, like the train car? Good question. It took a little while because the train car display kernel is basically the same kernel. So what I mean by that is you go into here and it shows it on the left side of the screen. If I go into a car on the right side of the screen, it will show it there. And it's the same display kernel, but this one is showing the caboose. Later ones are showing the inside of a coach car. To do that whole inside the car work kind of took me about 2 or 3 weeks. As an aside, the game was found in 2018, and I ended up starting it from scratch in 2018. But today, unfortunately, my job is not, though I wish it would be, to write 2600 games. I do own a design company called Tiki Interactive, which does video game work for clients around the world, from people like Pocket Gems to Activision to Zynga and other companies. And that unfortunately takes much of my full-time day effort. So that's why the game is taking the few years that it's doing. I see another question has come in. I saw one pop in. The size of the ROM. Interesting. The size of this ROM is going to be quite large, 256K. The original Keystone Capers 2 was only going to be 8K. And I had envisioned putting in some of the things that I have here, but I'm sure in a lot of cases, had I continued that game, I wouldn't be able to because of the size of the ROM. Our games back then were really limited somewhat by the schedule we were on, because people wanted to, Activision wanted to sell the game. They were in business and we couldn't work on a game forever. But more so, it was based on the fact that it was an 8K ROM. So you couldn't fit as much, and it took us probably 6 to 7 months to write the game. So as an example, Crackpots is a 4K game. For Gold Rush, instead of having one 4K bank, which I did Crackpots in, I have 32 4K banks. And so I'm filling it up with all the things that I would have wanted to do for Keystone Capers 2. So I will probably have 50 or more trains that you'll have to solve. I have 45 or 50 train cars. I have probably 30, 40 enemies. And I'll have some other screens in there that you can see. So back to the screen here, if I exit that, I can go to some of the areas, some of my earlier builds, and you'll see some of the enemy work I've been doing. So this is a little test kernel I set up with an old version of Keystone, of Casey O'Kelly. And oops, you'll see a problem there, but you'll see the spider there, the tarantula. And so I'll load another one. And this is kind of showing you a little bit of development. I mean, there's a guy who is on my circus car, and he's a little unicycle guy. And so what I do is I create these little kernel test programs to be able to write areas for the characters and be able to test the characters out. Let's see what this one has. Some of these go back quite a while, and so I'm not sure what is necessarily in them. Let's see that one. Now that one doesn't have anything either. Okay, let's see that one. Our same two characters. And one more. That one, as you can see, was a bad edit. There we go. So that one has kind of a flying character and an explosion. I see someone's also written another, this is going to be an epic game. You've put so much. Yes, I have put a lot in it. I put a tremendous amount in it. And I'm very happy that I have the ability to actually put as much in it as I want because of the ROMs. We'll go back to some really early versions of when I started writing this 2 years ago from scratch. This is one of the first screens you can see with a little error there. As I had discussed during the PowerPoint, I first put up the screen, the score, the mountains, started doing some of the background, and the bottom area, as you see, of the desert is empty. And so as I began to work, I eventually filled it up with some other things. Let's see what this one has. These are old builds. Oh, see, there's a build of actually the game, except you can see there's a problem up there with the mountains. And I don't believe I actually had the controls working. And you can see I was doing a test for how the game slows down. Let's see, someone else has written, since this game requires more memory, will your cartridge PCB need to be custom manufactured? Yes, the PCB is being manufactured. I'm actually creating my own cartridges, and I may actually have some samples here, which I actually don't see, but I will be manufacturing the game myself. Let me put back this screen here for you. There we are. I will be manufacturing the game myself. I'm actually going to be potentially partnering with another couple of guys who are in the homebrew business. And we will be making boards, and we will also be making our own cartridges. So what I want to do is what we want to do is offer this to the homebrew community as an opportunity for you to publish your own games. So we will have boards for you to buy, chips for you to buy, and cartridge cases for you to buy. So in case someone wants to create a 2600 game and wants to release it and do it in a little bit of an easy way, they can buy the parts from us and then sell it through Atari Age or whatever they'd like to do. And so why don't we do some Q&A now? I think some of you have already sent in some questions. If you have any, please send them over. And I'm actually going through. I see a lot of them here that I may not have answered. Somebody mentioned Little Computer People. Yes, Little Computer People was actually created by David Crane, and I and my brother Gary had worked on it, and then I ported it over to the Apple II computer. So that's why you see that on my screen earlier. Someone still has the original copy of Game Maker. The Game Maker was an incredible product my brother created. I did a lot of the demos for it, and it was such a powerful tool that I think I wrote Pitfall in Gary Kitchen's Game Maker in about a week and a half, where it took Dave, obviously on the Atari, 4 or 5 months. So it was an incredibly powerful tool. It's a wonderful tool. If anyone has, if you go onto my website and write me a message or email me at dan@dankitchen.com, I'll be happy to talk to you about some of your games. Someone mentioned they'd like me to sign copies of Nanostray and Nanostray 2. Those are two games I had produced while I was at Majesco Entertainment for the Game Boy Advance. And I frequently have people send me games. I sign them and I return them, tracking and postage paid by me. And I'd be honored to do that if you wanted that in these days of social distancing. I'm looking. Dylan writes, amazing assembly language is the key to amazing gameplay. It really is. But of course, with the processor speed these days, people can write good games using C or Objective-C. But back then, everything was, BASIC was too slow. So everything had to be written in assembler for those simple microprocessors. Dylan also writes, oh my God, super limited edition patch. That's wonderful. Mega Mania patch. I'm still a frequent player of Mega Mania. Let's see. There goes. So someone says they earned the patch for Stampede. That was Young Park. Just earned the Stampede patch. There are some games of Activision I still haven't earned the patch for. And it's just, some of them were just really tough. We had created games back then really for young players. And people tell us often, you made the games too hard. I now look back and see the games and I say, yes, we made them too hard. But people liked hard games back then. It was interesting. But if I had my druthers, I'd go back and do some changes to Keystone. I'm sorry, to Kung Fu Master, which I think is hard to play. Unfortunately, I didn't have a second button to make it jump and you press up on the joystick. But I would do some timing changes and make the game a little easier. But this game, I assure you, will be fine-tuned. Will certainly not be too hard to play. And I've taken all my years of frustration at playing games to do the opposite in this game and make the game very fun and enjoyable. Now, I do have a second game coming, which you can read a little bit about on my site, although I don't have a dedicated page to it. And as you'll see, it's kind of like a ship, as you see, right? Mechanic-based, as it floats off the screen there. A game called Bon Voyage. That game will be my next game after Gold Rush. And, actually, I may be able to give everyone a little sneak peek at what that game will eventually look like. Let's see if I have that. Let's see here. Just taking a minute to go through some of my builds and see if I have that. Well, I may not actually have that. I can show. So let me share the screen again. Let's see. Let me share the screen quickly because I know we're running low on time. I will share the second screen. Here we go. I do have an animated sequence for the beginning of the game. And so you can see that in this, that every game cartridge I have will have a startup. And the startup will show a retro TV set. It's Tiki Vision, of course. And giving my love of the islands and the South Pacific, you'll see a beautiful scene, and then it'll close up as it did in the old TVs of the 1980s and go right down to that. And that will be the actual intro to all of Tiki Vision games. And so that should be quite fun to have that. Let's see. I have a message from David. I love your game, Crackpots. It's brilliant. I only actually discovered it a few years ago, and not only one owned back in the day. Have you seen the Commodore 64 version? Yes. Yeah. The gentleman who created the Commodore 64 version have reached out to me. I was delighted to see they had done a Commodore version of Crackpots. They're actually talking to me about taking Gold Rush and porting it over to the C64 as well. It's wonderful to see people still take the games that we wrote so many years ago and not only enjoy them, but want to bring them to other systems. I do have plans also to take Gold Rush once it's done and bring it to some of the other systems. I'm hoping to put it onto the Amiga system, which Tommy Tellerico is releasing. It will be on your phones and tablets to kind of bring some of the nostalgia of the Atari 2600 over to that. And lastly, I'm just taking a moment to see if I have any more fun work to show you. Let's see. I might actually, just trying to see if there's anything else that I have from my my work. Well, let's see. Periodically I play with different ideas, and if you go to my website, you'll see that I'm following up Gold Rush with Bon Voyage, and then I have another game coming after that I've already conceived and done a little work on, which is too early to show, and it is a game with some magic. Having worked with Penn and Teller, I've always been fascinated with magic. In fact, I was an amateur magician in my youth when I was not writing video games. And so I wanted to bring my love of magic to an Atari game. And so after you're done sailing on the Bon Voyage cruise, you'll be controlling a little magician as he wanders through a fanciful world of magic. And that will end up being probably my next video game on the Atari 2600. So I want to thank everyone for coming to the Long Island Retro Gaming Show UPLINK event. It's been wonderful to be a part of. It's been so much fun to share with you some of my behind-the-scenes work of what I'm doing. And if anyone has any more questions, I would love to answer them. I see Ron just came up. Thanks so much for your time and your presentation. I look very forward to playing my games too. I'm hoping to squeeze in some more hours coming up because I want to release Gold Rush this year. It may be released with another game that will be that is created by the other two people I'm working with, and that'll be disclosed soon. Hopefully we'll release these two games. The other one I have to keep quiet on. It's a homebrew game that I've seen, and these two games will come out before the end of this year, and then next year, hopefully soon, before the end of the next year, somewhere in the middle of the year, you'll be able to set sail on Bon Voyage. So thank you guys. Good luck with everyone. Have a wonderful day and have a great time at the Long Island Retro Gaming Expo. Thank you so much.